done a quick acknowledgement of country. I normally do my acknowledgement. I was lucky enough to grow up with learning to speak language at a young age. But I grew up learning how to speak that literally because of what happened within my family and the construct and the government policies and legislations that would actually be set into place to break me from my traditional identity. Those actually being the stolen generations, the relocation and resettlement policy, as well as the out-of-home care policy that we currently have in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids. I'm going to say Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. I'm not going to use the word Indigenous. I was taught not to actually say the word Indigenous. I come from a legal background, so my family are quite political and not backward and coming forward. That's a nice way of saying it. So I was always taught Aboriginal is actually a term that was placed upon us by the British. You could go to South America or Canada or Africa, and their First Peoples will also be called Aboriginal. It's a Latin term. I was always taught to identify with the language group and the nation that I actually come from. So when I identify myself, I won't say Aboriginal, I'll actually say Bundjalung. So that's actually the nation that I come from. And that nation that I come from is because that's where my mother's bloodline comes from. Yes, I'm born down here in Sydney. I'm Redfern boy. Well, it was Redfern. They moved the street, and apparently I grew up in Chippendale now. But I don't come from here. I have a cultural affinity to here. I was born through the land and water down here, but I still come from my country. So I can't actually come in and talk for this country, and I can't claim this country as my country. Yes, I'm born here, but it's not my country. Your country will only ever come back to where your family come from. Now, 97% of the nations are actually going to do it in accordance to the matriarchal line. So women are actually going to be the that touchstone for me. So I'm my mother's son. I'm not my father's son. My identity is even that strong. Being Bundjalung, I will carry my mother's last name, not my father's last name. On my driver's license, because mum and dad were actually married, I had my father's name, but from the day I was born, I carry my mother's name. They're not worried about that I was Alwyn's son. They're worried about that I'm Beverly's son. Does that make sense to you all? So when you're going in, a lot of people will get confused around where they're actually born versus where they're actually from. Now, First Nations will always say to each other the three little words, where are you from? And that's talking about the placement of where within Mimigawaja or Mother Earth you actually descend from. So when you're going in and you're doing it as part of your identity and placement, so I would actually be going in and saying, oh, I come from Arakwal, so I come from black sand, salt water. I don't come from Waibor, which is Gayugal country. So that's actually, there's only a, sorry, Charmaine, really quick, what's the distance between Gayugal and Byron? Do you know? So it's only like 60 something kilometers, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
but
I don't know in kilometers, but it's just over an hour away by car.
Okay, so there you go. So me even coming from, I have an affinity but I can't actually even claim that country. That country is fundamentally different to me. Even though it's within my nation, that language group in that area, because when we go in and we talk about traditional or cultural identity, it all comes back down to three key things: respect, responsibility, and reciprocity. I will ask you who you are and where you're from to then figure out what your traditional identity is going to be to me, and then how I will demonstrate that. Am I allowed to sit next to you? Do I have to walk behind you? Are we even allowed to make eye contact? Okay, because I'm younger-ish, okay, I'm trying to get away, don't let this, this has been grey since I was 15. So because I am younger, that may mean that I may not be allowed to look certain people of a certain age in the eye. Because I'm younger and I'm a male, I may not be allowed to look women directly in the eye. Remember, I come from a matriarchal and we follow women, and women are the ones that actually choose. So I'm not going to look any woman directly in the eye and she thinks that I'm actually showing interest, because she may then start the process in relation to marriage from there. So I'll say, where are you from, to then figure out what your traditional identity is, or your cultural identity is to me. Now, identity is completely different to the three ways that they actually expect you to do it now. They expect you to identify that you have Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander blood. So you are a descendant. You identify yourself as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and you are acknowledged by a community that you are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. That is a traditional, that isn't a traditional way. That is a government legislated way. It has to be done under an organisation that actually, so has any of the First Nations people, just put up your hand, has everyone got their confirmation of Aboriginality? Or have you found it difficult for you to be able to get your confirmation of Aboriginality? Yeah? So I had mine when I was 16, 17, starting school down here in Sydney. And I actually burnt it. I don't have my confirmation, because that doesn't give me my traditional identity. That is the way that government, I view, that government has that degree of control over. It is very difficult for a lot of people coming back now to, because of the policies and the legislations that have actually affected. It's very difficult for a lot of people to come back now and be able to gain that, because the families may not have been growing up on country. They may have been forcibly removed. All of that kind of stuff. Traditional identity, though, versus that, is six things. I was always taught that traditional identity is the nation that you belong to, the language group, or the regional area within the nation that you actually come from. It's your kinship, it's your moiety, it's your skin, and it's your totems. Does that make sense? So it's not three, it's six. I'm pretty sure that you all would have heard of these, but this traditional identity is all about placing you back to country. This traditional identity is all about making sure that you have respect, responsibility, and reciprocity to where you come from and everything that exists in the country that you come from. Now, when I talk about country versus nation, it's different. So when I say country, I'm actually talking about the actual land and water that I come from. When I talk about nation, I'm talking about the actual Bundjalung versus Dangari versus Radri versus Eora, all of that kind of stuff. So country is going to be reliant very, very specifically on the geographical, what actually exists within that country. So think of it this way. So if I'm going to identify myself as Bundjalung versus me identifying myself as Gamilaroi, does anyone know what the difference between Gamilaroi and Bundjalung are?
Most recently, Bundjalung is matrilineal.
Yeah, no. I mean, like, so if I'm identifying myself, think about the geographical and the core things that would actually make me different fundamentally to Gamilaroi versus Bundjalung. What does Bundjalung hit on one side? So what is one of the borders for the Bundjalung Nation?
Ocean.
Yeah. So Bundjalung will be classified as a saltwater nation or a bitter water nation, where Gamilaroi is a river nation. So they're classified as a freshwater nation or a sweetwater nation. Does that make sense to everybody? So that land and that water is actually going to be the defining thing for your identity. Now, mob will automatically say to you, are you fresh or are you sweet? Or are you bitter? Sorry, are you salty? You were salty or you were fresh? Because Roberts, okay, Roberts is a big family name, and it's a name that other First Nations families have also married into. So if they were to come back and they were to say, "Oh, are you Maureen Roberts or are you Lismore Roberts? Are you Lismore Roberts? Are you?" So think of the placement within the country of, probably, I'll do it this way. If I share a screen for you, can anyone okay? So if I share this, so if you can see, the nations that hit on the eastern seaboard are going to be classified as saltwater nations. Then you'll have the nations that, if we go in and we go in a little bit further, can you actually see what you would see with the rivers and the catchment areas? So if you go into Moree, it's going to be viewed completely different because it's a large river catchment area, predominantly flat, versus then going into a mountain country versus going into a coastal. Does that make sense? So when I go in and I identify myself, I'm all about placing myself to that country. So, sorry, I couldn't see you when I share a screen. I can't actually see you to be able to do. So does that make sense to you? Just by looking at it from Google Earth, going in and doing. So Bundjalung or Arakwal Bundjalung is the black sand of the lagoons behind the beaches. So I come from that rainforest and that tea tree country behind the beaches. So the tea tree is actually going to define me as a person, because that water is going to define me. Tea tree will change the color of the water, and the water will change the color of the earth. So that is all. So me being able to learn how to do my medicine, how to do my food, how to speak my language, because I will speak language differently to a nation that comes from a different landscape. If you can see, Bundjalung actually has a lot of mountain ranges running through it. So my identity is actually going to come back down into that landscape as well, in the way that I speak. So Bundjalung is actually going to be quite a pitchy language when it's actually done. So it's like, versus from where my dad comes from, which is a basin country. So it's actually going to be quite a low sound. It's going to be like, does that make sense to everybody? So think of the landscape of where you're actually from or where you're currently on, and think about how it's actually going to be produced. So because there's 3 mountain ranges that run through Bundjalung, it'll go up and down 3 times. Yeah. So you're gonna go up and down a lot of the time. So if the nation actually starts on the back of the Great Dividing Range and then plateaus out into the Plains country, how is it then going to sound? It's going to start quite high and end quite flat. Or do you come from just a flat country like Auntie out in the marshlands of, where my auntie comes from, out at Brie and all of that kind of stuff, and out in Walwyn country, what she calls a mountain, I'd call a hill. From where I come from, I wouldn't even call it a hill; it's a bump, basically. But so when they actually talk, it's actually at a very flat level. So when you talk and you talk, we even do it today. So the mob has anyone noticed how we've actually picked up traditional language in the way that some of the communities will actually talk? So the mob from out in Western New South Wales will actually speak different to the mob from up on the Queensland New South Wales border. Has anyone ever noticed that? The difference between Eela, go away there, go on, you want to move, that kind of thing. We still do it. As much as they would like to try and break us of our traditional identity, they haven't been able to do it. Seriously. Because they've actually, the British and the subsequent generations that have been here have actually picked up our dialects and the way that we actually speak. Not only in the way that they've named some of the towns or some of the areas and all that kind of stuff, but you think of the accent difference between a South Australian, a Victorian, a New South Wales, and a Queensland. They picked it up. New South Wales is more of an NG sound to it. So it's nya, nya. Whenever you see NG, it's not naga, it's nya. Does that make sense? So it's more of a nasal and more pushed, or I'll do it this way. What's the difference between a Murray, a Kuri, a Kiri, Nunga, Nanga, Halawa? Does anyone know?
Just the area that they're from?
Yep. Depending on part of the songline. They all mean people. They are the traditional words for those songlines that actually mean people. So Charmaine, really quick, how do you guys identify up there? Are you Murray, Guri, Kuri? Which one? You have to take off the mute.
my mother's from, my mum's a traditional woman, but from up in the islands.
Yeah, but say your father's family.
My father's white,
Okay.
but all my sisters and brothers, they are Arakwal, Githable.
So
They're my brothers and sisters. So I was born first, and then I have brothers and sisters, and my mum came down here and married. Yeah.
So when they identify themselves, do they say they're Kuri or Murray or which way?
No, none. So just not really. It's not that much spoken. It's more just you just do your thing. We're just quiet, like
You're quiet.
yeah. You just go when you're on country. You're on country. You know where you are.
Yeah.
You know what you're doing.
But I
Because
mean, like when you go over into another area or any of that kind of stuff,
you got to be careful.
You got to be very, very careful. I mean,
and either you are acknowledged by that area, or you sing out, and I mean acknowledged by the area in a way that's, and my mum would say in a traditional way, that the elementals of that area acknowledge you. And if they do that, they have to meet you once, and they'll know you forever.
Yeah, I was always taught when you go into another country, you ning. So you ning. So traditional ning. Anyone? Does this ring a bell with any of the other First Nations? Ning versus ningana. Shh, be quiet. Shut up. Ning is shh. Ningana is you best be shutting up now, kind of thing. So when you go into another country, you have to pay that respect. But the mob will automatically say to me, are you Kuri or are you Guru? Because they know with the Roberts where it's actually going to sit as well. So has anyone ever said, to another First Nations person, are you Kuri? And they come back at you real quick and they go, no, I'm Murray. Or I'm a Guri, or any of that kind of stuff. So that's also a traditional identity kind of aspect to a lot of that stuff, and that will come into a large geographical kind of an area. That nation will actually hit in on that. So do you belong to Miami Songline? Do you belong to Wandjina, Rainbow Serpent, Bandula, Gulliga? All of those kind of songlines will actually make that placement. But when it's actually produced, there's a really, really simple way that you can actually identify it. If somebody says they're Kuri, or if somebody says they're Kuri, what's the difference? One is New South Wales and one is Victoria, because they're producing the sound in accordance to the country that they're from. So even when I hear it a lot with the Wiradjuri people, when you're actually going in and you're saying where you're from, or I'm Wiradjuri, the way that you guys actually produce the sound and the word Wiradjuri is completely different. So it'll tell me, do you come from Stony Slope? Do you come from the meeting of the rivers? Do you come from the red dirt country, or do you come from the big sky country within Wiradjuri? That makes perfect sense to me, because I had to learn all of that traditional identity stuff, because I'm not allowed to marry into Wiradjuri. because my great uncles and my uncles and my brothers, well, one of my brothers married out that way, so that then blocked me from being able to marry into that. See, this is part of the thing that you need to recognize when you're going in and doing traditional. Your kinship is going to be a huge aspect, and your identity is going to be everything for you. It'll tell you what you can and can't do. It'll tell you what you can and can't eat. It'll tell you what you, how do I say this? It'll tell you who you can make kissy face with, basically. Because I'm a Roberts, and we're a big family, so that means I'm literally going to be blocked pretty much on the eastern seaboard because I'm the youngest of the youngest. So the older people actually married out into those other areas, and that's why I was asking sister from out in Breeway, because those families out there married 4 generations ago into my family. So they're still part of my family within a traditional thing, because remember that respect level and that responsibility and that reciprocity. So if somebody marries within your kinship, that means that you can't marry within. I tried really good way, like years and years and years ago when I was very young, and I went out to Gaduga, and we came back, and Uncle took one look and went, no, not allowed. I'm like, what do you mean? So even out in Uali and all of that kind of area, I wasn't allowed to marry in because that family had married in within the traditional kinship. Now, my traditional kinship, where I come from, and you fellows where that watched the previous seminar. So traditional kinship is, for me, where I come from, is 6 by 6. So there'll be 6 families and 6 generations under each one of those families that I can't marry into. This is why they say where you're from. I walk in and I say, I'm Drew Roberts. Are you black sand saltwater? I'll say you're a Roberts, you're a King, you're a Bolt, you're a Close, you're a Mundine, and you're a Robinson. Those 6 families are actually make up my traditional kinship, or what you guys would actually within that geographical area. So I have to marry out of my geographical area, because traditionally women dictate that same blood is not allowed to be mixed. Okay, this is the reason why there's no First Nations person that looks anybody like the royal family, because the royal family are married into each other. Yeah, does that make sense? So I'm not allowed to touch anything under a 6th cousin. So I went out far western New South Wales, and then came back, and because this one's family had married into the Bolt family 5 generations ago, we were classified as cousins and same blood, and not allowed to be. So because Uncle said no and did the math in relation to it, not allowed to be. So I ended up going over the ocean. So I didn't have to worry about doing this math anymore, because I'm a Roberts. From Rockhampton down, I'm pretty much blocked. That's like how you doing? How you doing? That kind of thing is a really big part of my identity and my traditional identity. So my kinship and my nation will define that. Then the way I actually interact with my landscape and my world and my universe around me is going to come in a very specific way. It's going to come in with my skin. Now, Charmaine hit on a really interesting point that when she goes anywhere, she was taught to do it with an elemental aspect. Now, the easiest way that I can actually do skin for you in the way that I was taught it is it's actually going to come in under the creator. So we'll actually have a creation spirit. And then underneath the creation spirit, there will be 5. Okay, there will be 5 creation ancestors. And each creation ancestor is the one that's actually responsible for the creation of an element within the universe. So anyone want to hazard a guess what they think the actual creation or what they think the elements are within the world? Yeah.
Yeah. So the water
Water.
and the crystals, they're like the moon and the tides, and then the stars, they're the ley lines, and the feathers maybe, and
I think of the elements, the actual elements that are
so like
so
so all things, metal, uranium, all those things that merge and meld together, like oil and all those things that, like man, like serpent, like rainbow serpent, maybe.
No. So the actual elements, so water,
Yeah.
The earth, air, fire, and water.
earth, air,
Fire.
fire, and water. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what the 5th one is.
Anyway, honestly, anybody ever watch a cartoon on the ABC as a kid? Captain Planet? The 5th element is heart. Heart or spirit is the 5th element. So when you actually go back in and you have a look at that elemental, so you and I mightn't be related within. So my skin, and I'm only doing this in a very simple way. These 5 will then divide, each element will then divide into 2. Each 2 will then divide into 4. Each 4 will then divide into 16, telling you who the roles and responsibilities that you have, who you can and can't marry, all of that kind of stuff. Are they brother, sister? Do you have to call them mum? All of that kind of stuff. But I'm only just doing that first part for you. So that elemental thing is going to be really, really important. So let's say my creation ancestor is water. Okay? So for me, creation ancestor for water is Tiddalik. Anyone ever heard this story, or anyone ever taught the story of Tiddalik? The frog that was greedy and drank all of the water.
I don't know, but when I was little, I used to imagine I could drink that ocean. Every time I'd see the ocean, I'd be like, you know, if I could fit that whole ocean in my tummy, I'd be drinking that ocean. Just cute.
Well, Tiddalik for me, for Bundjalung, is why there's no word for thank you. There's no word for thank you in English. But there's 16 different ways you can say greedy in Bundjalung. You could be greedy of heart, greedy of mind, greedy of spirit. You could just be greedy because you're deadbeat greedy, kind of thing. So when I go in and I identify myself as water, so Graham, the elements were earth, fire, air, water, and heart. Okay, so let's say I'm actually descended from Tiddalik, or in that kind of way. So when I walk up to somebody and they say, and they tell me who they are and all that kind of stuff, I need to figure out what my responsibility is to them. With the skin kind of thing, it's also done in the same way. So I can tell you that my skin or who I am because it's passed down by women. Okay, so the women will actually pass down the skin to the children, and this is me. Not all nations will actually work this way. Other nations will actually do it differently because it needs to be different. Otherwise, you're pretty much going to be blocked on the east and every which way. So I walk in and I'd say I'm Tidlik, or the traditional name from up home, and then they'll actually figure out, are they the same as me? Now, if you are the same skin as somebody, you are not allowed to marry. Okay? So I can tell you my skin because I know the names of the women I descend from for 27 generations. Traditionally, it's taught through song and through dance and by physically being on country, but it's also taught by the necklaces that women actually wear. From up home, the women will take their hair and they'll connect it with their mothers and their grandmothers and so forth and place one little tiny shell. Different nations will use different resources on how they're actually going to do it. But for me, it's a little polished pink shell, and they place one shell for every life they bear into the nation. So let's say, okay, so let's say I go over into Gamilaroi country and I walk in and I'm in a different nation, I'm in a different language group, and I'm in a different landscape. Okay? By me walking, and they're a different kinship, they're not related to me in any way, shape, or form. They don't fall within my 6x6. But if they are the same skin as me, we're not allowed to marry. Because technically, we might be related within the 6 cousin way, or that 6x6 way. We might be related 26 generations ago, but it's still same blood. And same blood is not allowed to be mixed within a traditional sense. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
So when you're going in, never ever, I was always taught, never ever just walk in and think that you're drop dead gorgeous and pretty and all this kind of stuff. You need to figure out who these people are. That's why I went over the ocean, because I just got done. By the time I was 26, I'm like, damn, okay, I have to go to Broome and I have to go to Darwin if I'm going to be able to have that anonymity kind of aspect. Because all traditionally, people will actually carry that. We still carry it to this day, but have you ever noticed that it's done in subtler ways? They might do it to the community that you actually come from. You come from Ningan. No, that mob married in, or a really good example for me, one of my uncles married in Dakara. So there goes pretty much Kara taken out of the equation for me. Does that make sense to anybody? Yeah? Really quick, anyone got any questions on any of the stuff I was just talking about?
Hi, Drew. It's Mandy.
Yeah.
When you talk about different languages, when you traditionally, how were you able to communicate through different languages? Were they that different?
They are completely different. So like the difference between Bundjalung and the difference between Gamilaroi, the words don't actually even translate over. So in my mother's language, or actually I'll do my dad's language because it's a better example that I can do with Graham. So from where Graham comes from, which is Wiradjuri, okay, they'll have marang. I had the word marang as well, but it's got to be a double R, more of a R than a R. So marang versus marang. Marang in my father's language means good. In Wiradjuri, it means hand. Marang in my language means snake, and marang in his language is, I think, little ant or something. So even the words don't translate over. The only way that I've been taught to go from one nation to the other is in sign language. There is a traditional sign language that goes across the whole of Australia. And also down to the arts. So has anyone ever seen traditional art and you've noticed the differences in the art forms? So is it X-ray? Is it feather? Is it diamond? Is it crosshatch? Is it outline? Different languages will produce their art differently. And it's like reading the difference between hieroglyphs, Korean, and Latin. Does it make sense? Traditional art isn't because it looks pretty. Traditional art is the semiotics for language. It's language written. So me going in and looking, so me coming from more of that crosshatch and diamond landscape, where other nations coming from the desert will have more of that dot aspect because it's a resource base. Does it make sense, Mandy?
Yeah, it totally does. But how were those symbols exchanged? How did you actually understand each other? I know that often it's drawn in the sand and things like that, but that's a naive sort of simplistic way, perhaps, of thinking about it. But if you were going to go to a place where you were going to take a partner, how was the communication? Was it done all through pictures? I mean, is that how you communicated for the rest of your life?
No. So because your traditional identity is your nation, your language group, your kinship, your moiety, your skin, and your totem, you can, like for me, for example, I can marry within Bundjalung, but I can't marry language group, kinship, moiety, skin, or totem. So that pretty much means that I'm 98% or blocked within me being able to marry within Bundjalung. So 9 times out of 10, my grandparents are going to come from 4 different nations. And you learn the language of your grandparents from 4 different nations. So me growing up, I grew up learning to speak Bundjalung, Dungari, Anawan, and Gumbangi, because that's where the majority of my aunties come from. So I needed to learn the language from Gumbangi. So I wasn't a good kid. So I needed to know when they were growling at me and all of that kind of stuff, because they would do it in that kind of way. Now I was very, very, very lucky to grow up in that way, because I was born after it was no longer illegal to speak any of the First Nations in New South Wales. Department of Education decreed that it was illegal until 1972 to speak. So me growing up with that, I was able to then identify the differences between, if that doesn't make sense. So the way that you would say, are you well in Bundjalung is completely different to the way that you say it in Ngungari. So the difference between Ikiwala, so it goes up. So when you ask a question in Bundjalung, it goes like it does in English. Do you understand what I mean? Your voice will go up. Where in my father's language, it actually goes down, because it is responsive to environment, remember, and it's a big basin kind of country. So it's Miangan Danang. So they actually push it down. So Danang, it sounds like an exclamation point, not Danang. So for the first 15 years of my life, whenever I'd go home to my father's country, I thought I was in trouble, because I was so used to my mum's language, and I was so used to my dad. I was so used to English growing up down here in Sydney. So, oh, are you well? You good? You good? And here's my aunties going, baby, you good? Baby, you good? Even in English, when they were doing it in English, it still kind of freaked me out, because I thought it was like, oh, okay, they're growling at me. And the worst possible thing as a as a First Nations child, or even to this day, if I get growled at by the aunties, I still flinch. They only have to give you that look. Everyone knows what I'm talking about. They only have to give you that one way look, and then you stand up really, really straight. Or they do it through touch. Because they don't yell in traditional, I was always taught that it's a non-verbal, because my two nations follow women. So women will do it in non-verbal ways to be able to get the point across. They'll either do it in the sign language or the way that women talk just here. Okay, as a boy, I'm not privy to all of the language that women can actually do, but does everyone know the eyebrow thing? And if the eyebrow thing come in with the lip pushed out kind of thing, so the eyebrow thing is pay attention. The eyebrow and the pushed out lip is you want to run. It's the way I was taught, that you're in big, big trouble. So they're in that kind of way. Or the way that women will do the lip thing and do the... Anyone know what that means? When I do the lip push out, means, I was taught, it means you're cute. I think you're cute. So I only know when I'm in trouble and when they think I'm cute. Where my cousins can hold full conversations with each other across crowded rooms, just with their eyebrows and their lips and all. But as a boy, I'm not privy to that. That's a female thing. Or the other way that they would actually do it is through touch. So I was taught that if you're talking to somebody and you're not touching them, you're perceived as insincere. So,
And that
me,
might be true for when the woman asks this question. It's something that is a personal question as well, that she would ask herself in her mind's eye to her people, because all cultures have had some form of that communication. You know, we know from Aboriginal Australia that in ancient Egypt, we've got artifacts over there. They got artifacts over here. Now, how did that happen? And that was before. So questions that you want to ask, like, and you want a direct answer. Now, you're so good at explaining, by the way. It's so beautiful to listen to your story, to you telling story. To the woman who asked, hey, like,
so with that non-verbal, right? So just by doing it in touch, so, right? So my aunties would touch me 1, 2 on the elbow, or 3 on the shoulder. So imagine it being done like this. Drew, do you understand what I mean? Drew, do you understand what I mean? Drew, do you understand what I mean? Notice my voice didn't change, but the center for me is here, is heart. So the closer they get to my heart, the more emphasis they're saying upon the more emphasis upon what they're saying. So, Drew, do you understand what I mean? Drew, do you understand? Make me talk one more time. When they touch here, even to this day, I'm 40 plus. If a woman touches me here, I automatically flinch, because I know that they're actually yelling at me. They're placing more emphasis upon what they say to me. I used to have a non-Aboriginal director where I used to work, and she was very touchy, and she would always touch on their shoulders and all that kind of stuff while I'm actually sitting at my desk, and she'd come up and touch, and I'd be jumping like as if I was the most nervous thing. But it was just my cultural way that I was taught that if a woman is touching you in that way, you pay direct attention. Kind of, does that make sense? So this one's like, yeah. This one's like, yes, what? This one's, yes, what? Kind of thing. It's an interesting, it's that non-verbal communication
all over the world, but still strong here. That's deadly.
Does that make a little bit more sense, Mandy?
Yes, it does. It's just opened up a whole can of worms.
Well, and especially as like working within children's services and all that kind of stuff, you're not
Yeah.
allowed to touch kids.
Yeah.
Okay,
For old
where
people.
that's the thing. But how are you then? You have to use your words to be able to do that. I did a group of young First Nations people from within TAFE, and they started about 13, 14, and they went up to 17. These were high needs, of very, very high functioning, had high behavioural issues and all that kind of stuff. There was me and another Aboriginal woman that I grew up with. So we were able to do that shorthand kind of thing, that around with similar mob and all that kind of stuff. So we were able to do. Like one of the students literally had to have a carer pick them up from their front door, take them to class, sit with them in classes, and take them back because they acted out in such a strong way. One day, only took one day with him walking in and sitting down with uncle and with auntie in the room as the teachers, and he was fine. Had no issue. All she had to do was give him that eyebrow thing and go, "Wait, you want? I'm watching you," kind of thing, and he automatically knew what his boundaries were. The difference between the way that you're viewed within as an educator or that kind of stuff, or an auntie or an uncle, that respect and that responsibility stuff is still being taught within mainstream. And it's still within our communities and our families. It's just it mightn't be verbalized in that academic language that I used around nation language through kinship, moiety, skin, and totem. All of it went underground because the British recognised the importance of women to traditional identity, and they recognised the easiest way to be able to remove identity and create discord and disharmony amongst First Nations communities and nations is to
Duplicate their dark ages upon everyone else.
well, you question
Because
yourself.
that's where it went. It's been gone for, it's not possible things, you know.
So
Has
anyone see, and this is the thing I want is all to know. Whenever you go in and you're doing that identity kind of stuff, or thinking that I'm trying to think of how to say it in a nice way because I'm actually kind of a blunt person. My identity, my traditional identity, cannot be stronger than anyone else's. Each one of these First Nations people that are sitting on this broadcast come from a different nation, speak a different language, walk through this earth in a completely different way to me. They eat different food and they'll practice a different culture and religion to me. If I don't recognise and respect that fundamentally you are completely different to me in every way, shape or form, I'm not going to be able to function within traditional or in that kind of way. So this is why I was saying that traditional identity works completely different to that contemporary identity around descent, identity and acknowledgement. I do not have the right to call in to refute anyone else's identity because of their skin, the communities that they grow up in, or what they look like.